Chinese chess, or xiàngqí, is more than a classic strategy game. It's a fun and practical way into Chinese language and culture. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to return to one of my favorite topics, the intersection between language learning and games. I have covered this on the podcast many times before, most notably perhaps in episode 134, where we talked about using mahjong or mahjong to learn Mandarin. In this week's episode, we're focusing on a different classic strategy game, xiàngqí or Chinese chess. This game is very popular, although not as popular as mahjong. Even if most people don't play xiàngqí, they are aware of the game, roughly how it's played, and it's fairly common in media of different types, and people reference the game quite often. For example, one of the first books I read in Chinese was Qi Wang by Cheng, which is often translated as The Chess Master. And there are also various TV versions if you are interested. It's a famous story about an obsessive chess player during the Cultural Revolution, and while the language is not trivial, it's fairly approachable for intermediate students. Before we dig into xiàngqí in particular, I want to say a few words about using games for learning Chinese in general. Games often combine several good things. We use language in a meaningful way and communicate with others in games and while playing games, and it's also a great way of learning by doing. Many games can be played by beginners after a quick explanation and using a short cheat sheet with the most common words. This is true for both xiàngqí and mahjong, and you don't need more than a few dozen words to play these games in Chinese. Naturally, you need much more than that to be able to talk about the game or discuss strategy and the like, but to get started you really don't need that much. In the written article on Hacking Chinese, I have also provided most of the vocabulary you need to play xiàngqí in Chinese. And of course, if you're interested in mahjong, there is a separate article for that I will put a link to in the show notes, which also has a vocabulary list. Xiàngqí has a few advantages over mahjong in that you only need 2 players and there is no luck involved. Well, that last one is a matter of preference, of course, but not needing exactly 4 players to play is a benefit. So the game we're talking about in this episode is xiàngqí in Chinese, and that is unambiguous. There is only one game referred to as xiàngqí. Translated directly to English, this means elephant chess, but this name is not commonly used in English. Instead, people tend to either say Chinese chess or xiàngqí, as in you just have the pinyin or you pronounce it with an English pronunciation. It's worth noting here that we also have Chinese checkers, which is a completely different game, which actually isn't from China at all. In this episode, I will say xiàngqí to avoid confusion, and also because we are learning Mandarin here. So, how do you play the game? Well, the rules are fairly similar to normal chess, or Western chess, or international chess. So if you can play one, the other is not hard to learn. If you have no clue about how to play either game, it's basically about taking turns moving pieces on a board with the goal of threatening and trapping the opponent's general. Beyond the general, you also have guards, elephants, horses, chariots, cannons, and pawns. These move and capture the opponent's pieces in different ways, not unlike the pieces in Western chess. The family resemblance between these games is not accidental. Most historians see both as branches of the same family tree, usually traced back to an Indian war game called chaturanga, which spread west through Persia to Europe and also east to China and other parts of Asia. Exactly how the game has developed historically is debated and not something I want to go into here, but modern xiàngqí clearly belongs in the same broad chess family as international chess and Japanese shogi, among others. If you have more than cursory experience with Western chess, learning xiàngqí is pretty easy, because most of the rules are quite similar. But sometimes this similarity can trip you up as well. You think that something works in a certain way, and then it doesn't. Since I think most listeners will be at least familiar with the basic rules of Western chess, I think it's worthwhile to go through a few points where they are different. So first, pieces are placed on the intersections of lines, not inside the squares as in Western chess. Second, the generals, which are the kings then, are locked inside 3x3 palaces, and they can only move one step at a time along lines on the board, and thus they feel much more limited than the king does in Western chess. Third, the generals are not allowed to see each other along an empty file, so this is also different from Western chess, where there is no such effect. Fourth, cannons move like rooks, but they must jump over exactly one piece when capturing. And while this sounds simple, I can tell you that when you get started with xiàngqí, this is very confusing if you're used to Western chess. Fifth, horses move almost like in Western chess, but not quite. They move one step orthogonally and then one step diagonally, which means that they can be blocked depending on where the other pieces are standing, whereas in Western chess the horse just jumps over everything. Sixth, elephants move 2 points diagonally and are not allowed to cross the river, so they are much more limited than bishops in Western chess. Seventh, the pawns also work differently, or the soldiers as they are called. They never promote, but they gain sideways movement after crossing the river. Eighth, the starting position is much more open, with no pawn wall, so chariots, cannons and horses are relatively free to move as they please right from the very start, which means that attacks also start much quicker. And finally, number 9, stalemate counts as a loss for the side that cannot move, not a draw, which changes how many endgames are played. So the point here was not that you should memorize all the rules, but if you pick up xiàngqí and you know the basics of Western chess, this is almost everything you need to know to be able to play, and that is much easier than describing the rules from scratch. So how do you play xiàngqí in Chinese then? Well, in a sense, it's very easy. You don't need to say anything at all, unlike in mahjong, where there are certain things you're expected to say out loud when playing the game. You do need to be able to recognize the pieces though, because unlike in international chess, the pieces only have Chinese characters on them and they otherwise look identical. It doesn't make much sense to talk about what the characters look like and how they are written here on the podcast, but if you're interested, you can go to the article on Hacking Chinese. The only thing I want to mention here is that the pieces don't look the same for both players, so we have red and black, and sometimes the same piece looks different depending on whose piece it is. So for example, the general is called shuai for the red player and jiang for the black player. And so you will then need to learn 2 characters to know which the general is. I should also mention that some of these differences are not present in modern simplified Chinese sets and sometimes not in digital apps either. But in the traditional version, many of the pieces do use different characters for the same piece. So just like with mahjong, there isn't that much Chinese in the game itself if you just list the words, but that doesn't mean you can't use it or should not use it to learn Mandarin. When playing games with native speakers, you talk to them, you talk about what's happening in the game, you can ask questions, etc. And all this is excellent practice. Real communication focused on the board right in front of you. Learning about and explaining games is a good way to practice Mandarin in general. And for example, you can watch videos about how to play xiàngqí in Mandarin, or you can check a clear written guide with clear graphics if you want reading practice. And I have put links to these things in the show notes. There are also many things you might want to say or talk about which aren't pieces themselves, so how you move, what happens, things on the board, etc. As mentioned, there is a word list in the written article on Hacking Chinese, so I'm not going to go through all these words here. I have also included a short strategy guide for beginners if you want to play xiàngqí without feeling like a fool every time. This means we're ready to wrap up this episode by zooming out a bit. xiàngqí is a great game for learning about language and culture, just like mahjong is, and there are many benefits to using these and other games in your learning. You don't need to stick to classic strategy games either, so you can find mobile games, board games, video games, etc. And all of these can be turned into language learning opportunities in one way or another. We talked more about how to use games to learn Chinese in general in episode 105, so tune into that one after this one if you want to learn more. Finally, if you've played xiàngqí or you've learned something about language and culture through the game, I would be delighted to hear about it, so please head over to Hacking Chinese and leave a comment. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.